Hey everybody, this is Dream, and on Friday we have a nice little 8-game slate of football games for college in the main slate. We have some pretty good teams here, and we have some average teams and some kind of terrible teams. Uh, I've gone through and I've found a couple, about 5 or 6 quarterbacks, 5 or 6 running backs, and about 10 wide receivers that we could take a look at as useful players to play with in your main lineup. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the quarterbacks. So for the first 2 quarterbacks, these is going to be Michigan State's quarterback Peyton Thorne. He has 30,000 plus yards last season with 27 touchdowns and 10 interceptions, and he is going up against a pretty weak opponent. Now here's the only glitch with him is that they might blow them out, and if that's the case, he may not play as much. But you can see last year that he had a couple games early in the season. They were kind of hit or miss, but as the season progressed, he definitely upped his average, which is why he averaged about 22 fantasy points a game. I would expect him to get in the 25 to 30 range, and they are going to throw the ball pretty good. So hopefully that's about what we get. Then we have Illinois' quarterback, DeVito. Let's see if I can find him here. So they actually played last week, and he did 27 for 37 passing with 192 yards against Wyoming and 2 touchdowns. And I looked that he has the potential to kind of do a similar thing. Hopefully he can get a little bit closer to 20 fantasy points. But, with his price range of $5,300, that's a really good price for what he could do and what his potential is in a game like this against Indiana, who's probably a slightly weaker opponent, honestly, than Wyoming was. Obviously some people might disagree with that, but from what I can tell defensively and stuff, the opponent rank for Wyoming was a little bit tougher, and so I definitely like him as an option, especially at a cheap price point, which is going to help you pay for some other people. The next guy is Grant Wells for Virginia Tech against Old Dominion. This game is actually projected to be pretty close, so that's going to help keep him on the field throughout the game, and he, as you can see, 3,500 yards and 16 touchdowns, along with 13 interceptions. He was pretty solid last year, but obviously he's going to probably be better this year because he's transferring from Marshall, and so he's going to have a better team around him and better wide receivers and stuff like that. And so we have to assume that he can get as many points per game this year as he did last year, and probably a little bit more. And so overall, I think that he's a pretty good solid option. He liked to throw the ball a lot at Marshall, and hopefully he's going to have a similar output at Virginia Tech. They have one of their main running backs is hurt, so he's definitely going to be relied on more throughout the game. And it's supposed to be a pretty tight game, 7-point spread on the game itself, so hopefully he will be a good guy to use. Then the next guy I have listed is Taylor Powell for EMU. So for Eastern Michigan here, he threw for 1,200 yards last season in 6 games against the University of Troy. So obviously that's a little bit different, but he still did really well as a quarterback, and he threw the ball quite a bit. He could improve his accuracy a little bit against good teams, but he's not playing a good team this week, so that doesn't hurt us too much. He should be able to score quite a few points, and he will be the starter after winning that quarterback battle, and he's a senior, so he's definitely got some history under him where he's used to playing and stuff like that. So I definitely like him as a potential option at quarterback. And then there's 2 other quarterbacks that I'm just going to mention. One of them is Parker McKinney at EKU. Obviously, this is going to be a tougher matchup for him, but he did score a crap ton of yards and touchdowns last season, despite the fact he's not in a very good team. And he actually does run the ball quite a bit for a quarterback. So we definitely like to see that. If he gets 5 to 10 rush attempts and then throws 30 to 40 times, then he has a really good shot of having a really good game. Obviously, his price is really inexpensive. However, he is favored to lose the game, and that might influence how he plays, or he might not just do very good against the opponent. But overall, I think that he's probably a little bit more risky than Tommy DeVito at Illinois, but I still think he has just as much upside as he does, especially if they can keep the game close, or maybe the defense doesn't do so good against them. And then the only other quarterback I'm going to mention is the Indiana quarterback situation. Um, let's see here. Let me see if I can click this here. All right, so in this particular situation, they have two quarterbacks that are battling, Jack Tuttle and Bazalik. Now, because they have two different quarterbacks, they're kind of dead even for a starter. They're not actually going to tell us who the starter is until the day, a few hours before the game actually starts, which actually makes this a little bit more difficult to tell you on the video. So Indiana does throw the ball a lot, and if you don't put your lineup together until after they make the determination on this, you might be interested in using one of these guys as quarterback. They're both pretty inexpensive because they do throw the ball a lot. So I'm a little surprised at the expensive side, but I wonder if that's just because DraftKings wasn't sure which guy was going to start, and so they decide to kind of mix this up. One quarterback situation to avoid is TCU. They are actually going to be utilizing Morris and Dugan as a dual quarterback threat situation. Now, they're both pretty decent quarterbacks, but if they both play a significant amount of time, that's definitely going to harm both of their total outputs. So that's pretty much what I have for this game, for this slate in quarterbacks. I think it's a pretty solid slate for quarterbacks. We have a couple good options, in different price ranges. And just remember, and on DraftKings for college football, you can put a quarterback into S-Flex as well. I highly recommend doing that on this slate because there are some good quarterbacks that we can utilize. There's nobody that's like way up over the better than anybody else except for maybe Kansas's quarterback. But the expectation for that game is for it to be a complete blowout. And so he's a little bit risky when it comes to that, and he's expensive. So that's why I left him off. But overall, I think we have quite a few good quarterbacks to choose from. And then if Indiana figures out their quarterback situation, then we could potentially utilize one of those guys. As for running back, I only have really 6 guys that we can look at. The first one is Boone Jr. for EMU. He has run pretty well in his past. Obviously, he wasn't a full-time runner like the most big one, but they are going to be. He is going to be the guy that I think is going to score the most fantasy points as a running back, just because he's going to be the starter for Eastern Michigan. However, he is a little bit risky because he hasn't really had that workload in the past. As you can see, I think his biggest game is 15 rushes. No, actually, he had 122 rush game. So we're going to see if he can replicate that kind of game. He's a little bit risky because of that, and he's also pretty expensive when it comes to running backs. But overall, he still seems like a pretty solid option. The next guy that I'm going to talk about is Jalen Holston for Virginia Tech. What would probably be their starting running back has been hurt, and so he's going to be taking over the duties. And they do have an expectation that he's going to have a pretty good year, and so I look for him to run the ball quite a bit and get pretty good amount of yards and stuff like that. So hopefully he will play pretty well, and he will be a good option for you. Then my next running back is Blake Watson for Old Dominion. Now, obviously, they're not expected to win the game, but he's actually minimum priced at $4,000. And we look at his career of 1,000 yards rushing last season and 9 touchdowns, and he should get 18 to 25 carries, which is a little bit low for what we would like. But in a tight matchup where the spread is which is 7 points, we can rely on the fact that he's going to get plenty of touches throughout the game. And if Old Dominion is going to try to pull off this upset, then they're going to have to get a good outcome from him. And Virginia Tech has got some issues defensively, so hopefully he can break through on those. But again, he's minimum price, and that's one of the reasons why I'm including him here. He's going to allow you to pay up for somebody else if you decide to use him. But he is a little bit risky because he's the underdog in the game. For Illinois, their running back is Chase Brown. He had a really good season last year, and then he started off this season with a 40-point game. And he's the focal point of their running back offense. They don't really pass the ball all that much, but they pass it, kind of decently, I guess. And they run the ball just as much. So we can lock him in as a top-tier running back because I believe they also are missing a couple other running backs that normally would play some. So we should expect him to have a big game again. And this time, of course, going against Indiana, he did really good against Wyoming, and I feel like Indiana is a slightly weaker opponent. and so I kind of look at him this game as a potential for a blow up game where he could score a lot of points. And he's also really inexpensive. He's definitely the play of the day for me based on his points output last week in week 0 and what his potential is for a game like this. And then, so I have one more running back that I want to mention, a singular running back, which is Kai Thomas for Kansas. He should get the bulk of carries early, but you do have to be worryful about a blowout. Last year, if we look in the game log, we'll see that he had some games where he didn't score a ton of points when they actually won by a lot. In the 2 games that they really had good, decisive wins, he didn't score as many points as he did in some of the other games. So that is a thing that we do have to consider and worry about. But overall, I still feel like for his price point, he's probably worth, even if he gets a couple touchdowns in the first half, he'll probably pay for himself. Excuse me. The last running backs that I actually want to talk about is WMU's running back situation. So Tyler and Jefferson here, these guys are both going to get a lot of carries. Both of them are going to get probably 10 or 15 to 20 carries. Now, the downside of this particular game is it's an expected blowout, and so they might not get as many carries as they normally would, but they are a 1-2 threat when it comes to the running back position, and they're both going to play a pretty good role in this particular game. If they can at all keep it close by running the ball, it's going to limit Michigan State's ability to score points, and then they will be able to definitely get some yards and stuff. So I don't necessarily love those guys, but if you need a cheap option and you don't, and you want to use one of those guys, especially as a, as a GPP lineup where you're trying to, do some alternate things to try to get ahead of the competition, those might be 2 guys that you might want to look at. And lastly, let's go ahead and get into the wide receivers. So I have quite a few wide receivers to take a look at here. So the first one is Du Bois and also Tucker from Charlotte. Both these guys have had really good first week games. Grant Du Bois had 89 yards and 2 touchdowns, and then Victor Tucker had 5 catches for 75 yards. And so we look at both those guys as good options for this week. Let's see, let me get the other guy up here so you can see who he is. Both of these guys have a good aspect in their offense, and he should, they should both be able to score us a decent amount of fantasy points. As you can see, Tucker's had some big games last year, and so has Du Bois. Sorry if I'm butchering his name a little bit, but both these guys have some upside in a good matchup for their team. Charlotte is predicted to win the game by 6.5 points, so that means that these guys are probably going to be in the game the entire time, and they've got a decent quarterback throwing them the ball. Not the best one, but a decent one, and so they have a point. They expect to score somewhere in the 30-point range as a team, and so with that, we definitely like those 2 guys at wide receiver as potential scoring ability. Jalen Calhoun, oops, I need to switch off Charlotte. Yeah, Calhoun for Duke going up against Temple. He has some upside. He had 700 yards last season and 56 receptions. They are going to throw the ball around, and he's going to get some good targets. You can see that his targets were pretty decent and that he has some good yards average, so we definitely expect that he could score some points, and he's now going to be the top wide receiver for Duke, so we should expect him to improve dramatically on what he's done in the past. So hopefully he will be a good option for us. He's also $6,500, pretty fair price point for him. Then let's get into the EMU wide receiving situation. So we have Badon and Drummond. These are the 1-2 punch for this particular team, and I expect these guys to do really well. Obviously, they didn't get as many touches last season, but Balin still got over 1,000 yards, and Drummond got 600 or 700. But now that they're the top 2 wide receivers, we should look for them to be to expand on those numbers this season and really take it to the next level. I definitely like these guys a lot because they have a good matchup against EKU, where they are pretty well favored, but probably not too much, where they'll get to play most of the game. And so there's going to have a lot of potential to score a decent amount of points. You can see the opponent rank is pretty high for EKU, and so we definitely think that those guys are good. Now, obviously, they're pretty expensive at $7,800 and $6,600, but overall, I think that they're going to be worth trying to fit at least one of them in your lineup, if not both. And then for Illinois, we have one wide receiver that we like here, which is Isaiah Williams. He had a pretty good season last year, but he looks to be the main guy this season, and so he will hopefully up his overall targets. Last week in week 0, he had 7 catches with 10 targets. Now, he typically wants to be an end zone guy, and so we're going to look for him to get touchdowns, which he didn't get in his first week. But if you look at his stats, he does actually have some potential, but they do typically find him in the end zone more than they find him in the main field, which is why his yards might be a little lower. So he's a little bit risky, but his price point is only $5,600. So if he can score a touchdown or two, then he definitely pays off in the long run. Our next guy is going to be from Michigan State. Now, like I told you before, for Michigan State, there's a little bit of a risk of a blowout here, or I guess a lot of a risk for a blowout here. So obviously, it's going to be a little harder to rely on these particular guys, but he can have a really good first half. Jalen Reed, he had a 1,000-yard season last season, including 11 touchdowns, and he should be the main guy for them this season, and he should up his targets and catches each game. And as you can see, that he averages a really high average per catch last year. So we definitely like him as an option, and if he can get to 20 or so points, then we'll be ecstatic, particularly in that game. Then we have 5 more guys. The next guy is going to be Ali Jennings at Old Dominion. Oops, hit the wrong button. This dude has had a really incredible season last season. Now he's going to have a tough opponent here a little bit, but it's not too tough. And so I look for him as going to be a really good option for Old Dominion. And he's also pretty inexpensive at $5,000. He's going to give us some upside that we don't get at that price point at this position. So he's somebody that if you need to save some money, you can split him in and really take advantage of what they've got going on. Okay, so then at TCU, we have one guy that we like here, Quentin Johnson. Now he's pretty expensive at $8,000, but he should be the starting main target for TCU, and they do like to pass the ball pretty good. He had 3 receptions for 600 yards last season and 6 touchdowns, so he definitely has some good output, and you can tell that he's, some of these games, even against good teams, he's getting 26 and 22 and 28 yards per catch, and so we look for him as kind of a home run threat. And he even had a game against Oklahoma where he scored 3 touchdowns, so you can see that he has some potential. Obviously, he's pretty expensive. There's a little bit of risk on that front, but it's an easier opponent than some of the opponents he's played last year because he's just going up against Colorado this week. So he's definitely my favorite guy from TCU when it comes to a wide receiver. And then I have 3 more guys. One of them is from Western Michigan. It is Mr. Corey Cromes. This guy... he had 765 yards last season with 6 touchdowns. He also caught the ball pretty well and has a really good yards per catch. And he actually had some really big ones like 75, 54, a couple of 54s in fact. So we definitely like him from that perspective. And he has a pretty tough matchup though against Michigan State. But if you want to save a little bit of money, $6,400, and if you think anybody at Western Michigan can actually score, he'd probably be the guy. And so my last 2 options are going to be from Virginia Tech, Caleb Smith and Jaden Blue. These are going to be your 2 guys. Not only do they have great matchup, and their game is going to be pretty tight, but they also have a pretty decent quarterback throwing them the ball, who I talked about at the quarterback portion of this. And so you could, potentially stack these 2 wide receivers with their quarterback, Grant Wells, if you wanted to. These are going to be your top 2 running wide receivers, for that position, for that team, and they look to have a big game in this particular situation. So overall, I think that these guys are probably going to pay off pretty good, especially because their price points aren't too ridiculous, and they're just going up against a weak offense or weak defense, despite the fact the game is going to stay pretty tight. So that's pretty much what I have for this slate. If you have any comments or questions, or if there's any players you feel like I've missed, feel free to leave them below in the comments. And thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.